Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. Today, we're going to be looking at the idea of God as provider. And we're going to be drawing specifically from the Christmas story in the Gospel of Matthew and also a passage from 1 Peter.
Yeah, and what's really interesting about these two texts is that even though they were written centuries apart, they both really touch on this very human need that we all have for reassurance and support, especially when life throws us those curveballs.
Yeah, and speaking of curveballs, imagine yourself, in Mary and Joseph's shoes. I mean, you've just had a baby.
Oh, yeah.
Probably not in the most ideal setting.
No, not at all. The source material mentions a stable, not exactly a 5-star birthing suite.
No.
And then, almost as soon as they've welcomed this newborn into the world, they're suddenly facing this terrifying threat from King Herod.
Yeah, I mean, it really makes you think, how did they even function with that level of stress? I mean,
right.
According to the sources, Herod wasn't exactly known for his, patience and understanding.
No, not at all.
He was, paranoid about losing power, and he had this reputation for eliminating anyone that he perceived as a threat.
Absolutely. History paints a pretty clear picture of Herod's ruthlessness. I mean, he even had members of his own family killed.
Wow.
So the threat to Jesus was very real and incredibly dangerous.
So how do they react to this? I mean, this is where we come to the concept of spiritual warfare, which is mentioned in the source material.
Right.
We often hear this phrase, but here it really takes on this very literal life or death meaning.
Exactly. And what's interesting is that Mary and Joseph don't try to fight back or reason with Herod.
Yeah.
They put their trust in God's guidance, which in this case comes through a dream.
Okay, so dreams.
Yeah.
I mean, they might seem kind of random to us now, but in biblical times, they really held a significant weight. They were often seen as this direct line of communication from God.
Right. This wasn't just a case of, I had a weird dream. This was very much an intervention, a message to escape the danger.
An escape they did. They fled to Egypt. And I mean, that definitely wasn't part of their initial birth plan.
No, it wasn't.
But it's striking that they went, despite not having all the answers, they trusted that they would be provided for, even when it didn't make logical sense.
Yeah, and this journey to Egypt really becomes this powerful metaphor for surrendering to a higher power.
Okay.
It's not about being passive and just letting things happen, but it's about actively choosing to trust that something bigger is at work, even when we can't see the full picture.
It makes you think, right?
Yeah.
Have you ever felt like you were being called to make a leap of faith, to trust even when that path ahead is unclear?
It does. And it brings us to that passage from 1 Peter, which encourages us to cast all your anxieties on him because he cares for you.
Right.
And this isn't just a nice sentiment, it's a call to action.
Right.
That suggests we actually have a choice in how we respond to our worries and anxieties.
And that choice, that act of, casting anxieties, it's not a one-time thing, right? It seems to imply this ongoing process, this constant willingness to surrender those burdens.
Absolutely. It's like building a muscle. The more we practice trusting, the easier it becomes to let go of anxieties and embrace a sense of peace, even when we're surrounded by chaos.
So how do we make that transition from this epic biblical story to our own lives? How can we, in a practical sense, cast our anxieties on a higher power?
Well, that's where things get really interesting. It's not about waiting for a literal dream or expecting miracles to rain down from the sky. It's about cultivating that inner knowing, that sense of being supported, even when life gets tough.
So we're not talking about denying the reality of our struggles.
No, not at all. It's about finding that anchor within ourselves, that source of strength and resilience that helps us weather the storms of life.
So if we imagine ourselves, back in Mary and Joseph's position fleeing to Egypt with a newborn, I mean, that's not exactly a relaxing vacation.
No, definitely not a vacation. But it highlights this profound trust that they had in God's guidance. And it's not just about the physical needs being met, the food, shelter, safety, but also the emotional and spiritual support that they must have drawn from their faith.
That ties in with this whole idea of refuge, which has both a physical and metaphorical meaning.
Exactly.
So Egypt became their physical refuge.
Right.
But it points to a deeper truth that we can find refuge in our faith, knowing that we're not alone in our struggles.
It's about recognizing that even in the midst of those storms, those moments when we feel overwhelmed, there is a sense of knowing that we're loved and supported, even if it's not always obvious.
Okay, so this journey to Egypt is a powerful metaphor. But how does it help us apply these concepts to our own anxieties, our own spiritual warfare?
Right.
What would you say is the connection between this story and those feelings of uncertainty that we all experience?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
If we look at the story, what stands out is that Mary and Joseph made a conscious decision to trust. But how do they cultivate that trust? Especially in a crisis situation where fear could easily take over.
Right. I mean, trusting in a higher power is one thing. But taking action based on that trust, especially when it involves fleeing your home with a newborn,
Right.
that's a whole other level of commitment.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it makes you wonder, did their cultural context play a role? Were there specific practices they used for discerning God's will? These are questions worth exploring further.
Definitely. And it's interesting because you mentioned the importance of finding that inner anchor,
Yeah.
that sense of knowing that we're supported.
Right.
But how does that translate into practical steps for someone who might be struggling with anxiety?
Well, here's where that First Peter passage becomes really relevant. It's easy to read, cast all your anxiety on him, and think, well, how do I actually do that?
Right. It's like, okay, I'm anxious. Now what?
Exactly.
Do I just sit here and hope it goes away?
That's where we need to dig a little deeper. The passage isn't advocating for passive resignation,
Okay.
but rather an active engagement with our anxieties. It suggests a shift in perspective, a recognition that we're not alone in our struggles.
So it's more about acknowledging the anxieties, surrendering them to a higher power, and then taking action based on that sense of trust.
Exactly. And the action itself can take many forms.
Okay.
It could be seeking support from others, engaging in practices that cultivate inner peace, or even simply acknowledging the anxiety without judgment.
So we're talking about building a toolbox of sorts.
Yeah.
A collection of practices and perspectives that can help us navigate those anxieties.
Precisely. And that toolbox is going to look different for everyone.
Yeah.
It's about finding what resonates with you, what helps you connect to that inner sense of support and guidance.
So for someone listening who might be thinking, okay, this is all great, but I'm still overwhelmed by my anxieties,
Right.
what would be a good first step they could take today to start applying this idea of trusting a higher power?
That's a great question. And it's important to remember that there's no one-size-fits-all answer. But one powerful practice could be simply acknowledging the anxiety without trying to push it away or judge yourself for feeling it.
So just acknowledging it is a step in the right direction.
Absolutely. It's about creating space for those feelings without letting them define you. And then from that space of acceptance, you can start exploring what forms of trust and surrender resonate with you.
It's like saying, okay, anxiety, I see you, you're here, but I'm not going to let you control me.
Exactly. And that shift in perspective can be incredibly empowering.
Wow.
It's about reclaiming your power, recognizing that you have a choice in how you respond to those anxieties.
So what you're saying is, even amidst the chaos of life, amidst those spiritual warfare moments, there's a possibility for peace and even a sense of guidance.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that's what makes the story of Mary and Joseph so powerful. They faced immense challenges, yet they chose to trust even when it seemed impossible. And in their journey, we find a roadmap for our own navigation of life's uncertainties.
It sounds like this idea of God as provider goes far beyond just material needs.
It does.
It's about providing us with the inner resources, the strength and resilience to face whatever comes our way.
Exactly. And that's a message that resonates across cultures and belief systems. Whether you call it God, a higher power, or simply your inner wisdom, there's a universal truth in this idea of being supported and guided even in the midst of darkness.
It makes me think about those moments in my own life where I felt completely lost, like I was navigating through a dense fog, and yet somehow I found my way, often in ways I could never have predicted.
That's the beauty of trust, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's about surrendering to the unknown, knowing that even when we can't see the path ahead, we're being guided towards our highest good.
This is reminding me of a time when...
It does resonate with me too. You know those moments when you kind of look back and you think, how did I even get through that? Like something was carrying us, through those tough times.
Yeah, and it brings us back to this idea of casting our anxieties. What does that actually look like day to day? I mean, we're not all fleeing kings, so how do we practically apply this, in our modern lives?
Right. It's not about, packing a bag and heading for Egypt every time we hit a rough patch.
Yeah.
But the principle remains the same. It's about recognizing when we're gripping onto anxieties too tightly and making that conscious choice to release them, to surrender them to something beyond ourselves.
So it's about that shift in perspective,
Yeah.
acknowledging that we're not in complete control,
Right.
that there's a bigger picture at play.
Exactly. And that shift can be so freeing. I mean, think about it. How much energy do we waste on things that ultimately we can't control?
Yeah.
Surrendering those anxieties frees up that energy for things that we can actually impact.
That makes sense. So it's less about like making something happen and more about creating space for something to happen through us.
I like that. Creating space. It's about cultivating that openness and receptivity to guidance, whether it comes from within ourselves or from something beyond. Recognizing that we're not alone in this journey.
It reminds me of that saying, let go and let God, but that can feel so abstract sometimes. Are there more tangible ways to practice this kind of surrender?
Absolutely. And again, it's going to be personal.
Yeah.
What works for one person might not resonate with another. But some common practices that people find helpful include things like meditation, spending time in nature journaling, or even just engaging in creative activities that help you connect to that inner sense of peace.
So it's almost like building a muscle, right?
Yeah.
The more we practice surrendering those anxieties, the easier it becomes to access that inner peace, even in the midst of chaos.
Exactly. It's like training our minds to let go of that constant need for control. And as we do that, we start to notice that things often unfold in ways that we could never have orchestrated on our own.
So what you're suggesting is that this idea of trusting a higher power, it's not about blind faith,
Right.
but rather an active practice, a conscious choice we make every day.
Absolutely. It's about cultivating a relationship with that inner knowing, with that source of wisdom and guidance that resides within each of us. And like any relationship, it takes time, effort, and a willingness to be vulnerable.
That makes me think about prayer.
Yeah.
It often gets kind of a bad rap, I think, for being passive or wishful thinking.
Right.
But maybe it's more about actively engaging in that conversation with something beyond ourselves.
I think you're onto something there. Prayer in its truest form is about opening ourselves up to guidance, to support, to a sense of connection with something larger than ourselves. It's not about demanding things from a higher power, but rather about aligning ourselves with that power and allowing it to work through us.
So it's like instead of saying, God give me this or that, it's more about saying, God guide me, show me the way.
Exactly. It's about surrendering our ego's desires and opening ourselves up to a higher wisdom. And when we do that, we often find that the solutions, the guidance, the support that we need has been there all along, waiting for us to tap into it.
This all ties back to the idea of God as provider.
Yeah.
But in a much deeper sense than just material needs.
It does.
It's about providing us with the inner strength, the guidance, the resilience to navigate the ups and downs of life.
And that's a message that can resonate with anyone, regardless of their religious beliefs or spiritual background. It's about recognizing that we're not alone in this journey, that there is a source of support and guidance available to us if we're willing to open ourselves up to it.
So if we were to sum up what we've explored so far,
Yeah.
it's about recognizing those anxieties, surrendering them to something bigger than ourselves.
Right.
And then taking action based on that sense of trust and guidance.
That's a great summary. And it's important to remember that this is a lifelong practice, a journey of continuous growth and learning.
Right.
There will be times when we fall back into old patterns of fear and control, and that's okay. The key is to just keep coming back to that place of trust, to keep practicing surrender, and to keep reminding ourselves that we are not alone.
So even when it feels like we're in the middle of a spiritual warfare moment,
Yeah.
surrounded by chaos and uncertainty,
Right.
there's still that possibility for peace and guidance if we choose to tap into it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that's the beauty of this journey.
Yeah.
It's about finding that stillness amidst the storm, that inner knowing that no matter what challenges we face, we are held, we are loved, and we are guided every step of the way.
This conversation is making me reflect on a time in my life when I was facing a particularly difficult decision.
We all have those, right? Where that path forward just feels totally obscured and like the weight of the decision is just so heavy.
It felt like I was standing at a crossroads, with no clear signs pointing me in the right direction, and like every option just came with its own set of anxieties and what ifs.
It's interesting how you describe it as a crossroads with no signs.
Yeah.
Because a lot of times I think when we're looking for external signs or answers,
Right.
we kind of miss those subtle whispers of our own inner guidance system.
So instead of looking for like a giant neon arrow
Right.
pointing the way, it's about tuning into that quieter inner knowing.
Exactly. And that's where this whole idea of surrendering to a higher power, of casting our anxieties, really becomes so crucial. Because it's when we release that need to control the outcome that we create space for a different kind of knowing to emerge.
But what if that inner voice is silent?
Right.
What if I'm just stuck in this spiral of what ifs, and I can't seem to access that sense of trust or guidance?
That's where those practices we discussed earlier, I think, really come into play.
Yeah.
Things like meditation, spending time in nature journaling. All of those things can help quiet that mental chatter and create space for that inner voice to emerge.
So it's not about forcing an answer,
Right.
but rather creating the conditions for an answer to reveal itself.
Precisely. And also recognizing that sometimes the answer isn't a clear yes or no. It might be a feeling, a nudge in a particular direction, or even just a sense of peace amidst the uncertainty.
It sounds like a lot of this comes down to trusting ourselves.
It does.
Trusting that we have the inner resources to navigate these decisions, even when they feel so overwhelming.
Absolutely. And that's where that First Peter passage, I think, becomes so powerful. It's a reminder that we're not alone in these struggles, that there's this loving presence that's supporting us every step of the way. It's about remembering that we are cared for, even when it feels like we're navigating through a dark forest.
It makes me think about those times when I've made decisions that logically didn't make sense.
Right.
But they just felt right in my gut.
Yeah.
And often those were the decisions that led to these unexpected blessings and opportunities.
That's the beauty of trusting that inner guidance system. Even when it doesn't align with our logical minds, there's a wisdom there that often transcends our limited understanding.
So going back to the story of Mary and Joseph.
Yeah.
Their journey to Egypt wasn't just about physical safety.
Right.
It was also about trusting that inner guidance, even when it led them down this really unexpected path.
Exactly. And that's a message that resonates so deeply, I think, today. We live in a world that constantly bombards us with information, opinions, external pressures.
Right.
It's so easy to lose touch with that inner compass.
So this idea of God as provider, it's about more than just meeting our basic needs.
It is.
It's about providing us with that inner strength, the wisdom, the resilience to navigate the complexities of life.
Beautifully put.
Yeah.
And it's a message that transcends religious boundaries. Whether you call it God, a higher power, intuition, or simply your inner wisdom, there's something profoundly reassuring in knowing that we are supported, even when we can't see the way forward.
So for someone listening right now who might be wrestling with a difficult decision,
Right.
feeling lost, anxious about the path ahead, what would be your advice?
I would just encourage them to take a deep breath, quiet the mental noise, and just tune into that inner voice, what feels right in your heart, what brings you a sense of peace, even amidst all the uncertainty. Those are often the whispers of your own inner guidance system.
And even if those answers aren't immediately clear,
Yeah.
it sounds like the act of surrendering those anxieties, of trusting that we're not alone in this journey, can be incredibly empowering in itself.
Absolutely. Because that act of surrender, that willingness to let go of control, that's often the catalyst for these unexpected breakthroughs and just a deeper sense of peace. It's about remembering that we're not meant to have all the answers, to figure everything out on our own. We're part of something much bigger. It's something that's always guiding us towards our highest good.
That's a beautiful reminder. So as we kind of wrap up this deep dive into this idea of God as provider,
Yeah.
what's the one key takeaway that you hope our listeners will kind of carry with them?
I would say it's this. Even when life throws those curveballs, even when the path forward feels totally unclear, there's a source of strength and guidance within each of us that is always available. And it's about cultivating that connection, trusting that inner knowing, and remembering that we're never truly alone on this journey.
Beautifully said. And for our listeners, if this deep dive sparked any reflections or questions for you, we encourage you to explore them further. Maybe take some time to journal, meditate, or just simply sit in nature and listen to those whispers of your own inner wisdom.
And remember, like Mary and Joseph embarking on that unexpected journey to Egypt, sometimes the greatest blessings come when we surrender to the unknown and trust that we're being guided towards a greater good, even if we can't see it yet.